Now let's take a little closer look at managing logins. Now in a previous video, I gave you a real quick run through on creating a login, but now I want to talk about managing the login. Notice what I've done. I've opened the Server Management Studio, and if I go to my server that I want to work with, there's a security folder, and I'll expand that just like I had when it opened up. And I'm going to pick on Frank. Frank's a user I created in a different video, and I'll just use him here. If I want to manage this particular login, what I need to do is right-click on the login, choose Properties, and this will bring up the login properties for that particular user. In this instance, it's Frank. Now, if you'll notice on the left side here on the Select a Page section, this is really a navigational area, and you'll notice it's context sensitive. Depending on which one I choose, my details area changes over here. Let's start with General and just step through these. On the General, I'll see my login name is Frank. I can change the password here if I would like. Notice even the administrators cannot see the passwords, regardless of what users say about us. Then these two things are really interesting. We can enforce password policies. Now, what does this mean? Well, Active Directory has password policies or account policies out there. If you've ever had Active Directory training, you know exactly what this means. If you haven't, what this means is Active Directory administrators can set up certain policies. For example, in the password policy, it means the password has to have a certain number of characters, say at least 8 characters. It has to have at least 2 special characters in it, meaning the pound sign, the parenthesis sign, this sort of thing. So we're trying to make them complex, hard to guess, hard to bust. Then we can enforce password expiration, which forces the user to change the password every so often. And obviously we're about security here. Okay? Then we can map this particular user to a certificate or to an asymmetric key if we're using those. This is kind of important down here. We can set this user's default database. And so Frank's going to be going into sales, the sales database, and so we'll map him into there. Right there. Now let's take a look at the server roles. We still have server roles in SQL 2005, so if you've been around the SQL for a while, you've seen these before, and notice they haven't changed. If I want Frank to be sysadmin for this particular server, I simply check, and Frank just became sysadmin. That'll take care of all those permissions for me. User mapping. Now this one's kind of interesting. One thing I have noticed, Bill Gates doesn't call me to ask my opinion on these kind of things, but boy, sometimes he really should. And so let's talk about this right here. Users mapped to this login. I don't know where that came from. I don't know what they're talking about. This really should say, allow this clown to log into these databases. Clown being a Tennessee technical term for user, of course. Okay, but really this means whichever one of these I check, Frank can access that database. So Frank right now can access the sales database. Now, once I've checked the sales database, I can then determine what database role Frank has in that sales database. So if I want Frank to be the database owner, or more or less the sysadmin for this database, I can give him that right down here very easily, single check. If I want Frank to be able to access the master database for some bizarre reason, I can turn this on and then determine what access level or database role membership he has. We'll get to default schemas a little later. Securables. This is where I set permissions. We will take a look at all of this a little bit later when we talk about managing permissions. But this is kind of cool. You'll like it. Then status. We can look at the status of Frank's login. Now this is really cool. This is kind of the emergency on-off switch, if you will, for the security aspects of the database administrator's job. Notice right up here, here's the on-off switch, permissions to connect to the database engine. We can grant it or deny it. We just basically turned him on or off right there. Then we can, at the login level for Frank, enable his login or disable his login. Okay, so again, you get a call. We found out what Frank's been up to. We're going to send Frank home for a few days and let him think about it. We're going to disable his login. We don't want him in here. Next is the status. Once we start playing with Active Directory on the login, password policies, and so forth, the user can lock themselves out by failing a password test. 3 times, 5 times, whatever our policy says. If the user gets locked out and they call you, this is where you got to go. Right-click on their login, go to status. This will be checked that they're locked out. Simply clear it, and they'll no longer be locked out. So that's how you manage the login for a particular user. We picked on Frank here. But obviously, you can pick any one of these users, and you're going to see the same type stuff on all of them, and you can step through and make those changes. So that's how you're going to manage your logins in SQL 2005.